Did they apply their ideas in practice behind the anarchist FAQ? Yes. The Makhnovists consistently applied their political and social ideas when they had the opportunity to do so. Unlike the Bolsheviks, who quickly turned away from their stated aims of Soviet democracy and workers' control in favor of dictatorship by the Bolshevik Party, the Makhnovists did all in their power to encourage and defend working-class freedom and self-management. See Section 14 for further discussion. In the words of historian Christopher Reed, there can be no question that the anarchists did everything they could to free the peasants and the workers and give them the opportunity to develop their forms of collective control over land and factories. The Ukrainian anarchists fought under the slogan of land to the peasants, factories to the workers, and powers to the Soviets. Wherever they had influence, they supported the setting up of communes and Soviets. They introduced safeguards intended to protect direct self-government from organized interference. They conducted relentless class war against landlords, officers, factory owners, and the commercial classes could expect short shrift from Makhno and his men, especially if they had taken up arms against the people, or, like the whites, had been responsible for looting, pogroms, and vicious reprisals against unarmed peasants on a colossal scale. From Tsar to Soviets. As we discussed in the last section, the core ideas which inspired the Makhnovists were working-class self-determination and land management. They aimed at the creation of a free Soviet system and the end of capitalism by rural and industrial self-management. It is to the credit of the Makhnovists that they applied these ideas in practice, rather than talking about high principle and doing the exact opposite. In practice, of course, the war left little room for much construction work. As Volin pointed out, one of the key disadvantages of the movement was the almost continual necessity of fighting and defending against all kinds of enemies, without being able to concentrate on peaceful and truly positive works. The Unknown Revolution. However, in the disruption of the Civil War, the Makhnovists applied their ideas when and where they could. Within the army, as we discussed in Section 5, the insurgent troops elected their own commanders and had regular mass assemblies to discuss politics and the agreed norms of conduct within it. In civilian matters, the Makhnovists from the start encouraged working-class self-organization and self-government. By late 1917, the area around Hulia Polia, the tolling masses proceeded to consolidate their revolution. The little factories functioned under the control of the workers. The estates were split up among the peasants. A certain number of agricultural communes were formed. David Footman. The aim of the Makhnovists was to transfer all the land owned by the gentry, monasteries, and the state into the hands of peasants, or to organize, if they wished, peasant communes. This policy was introduced from the start, and by autumn of 1917, all land, equipment, and livestock around Hulia Polia had been expropriated from the gentry and kulaks and placed in the lands of working peasants. Land reform had been achieved by the direct action of the peasantry. However, many of the peasants understood that the task was not finished and that it was not enough to appropriate a plot of land and be content with it. From the hardship of their lives, they learned that enemies were watching from all sides and that they must stick together. In several places, there were attempts to organize social life communally. In line with the socialist anarchist theory, the Makhnovists also tried to introduce collective forms of farming. These experiments in collective work and living were called free communes. Despite the difficulty in military situations, communes were established principally near Hulia Polia in the autumn of 1917. This activity was resumed in February to March of 1918. They reappeared in early 1919 once the threat of counter-revolution had been temporarily defeated. There were 4 of these communes within 5 miles of Hulia itself, and many more peasants afield. According to Mahnoa, these agricultural communes were in most cases organized by peasants, though sometimes their composition was a mixture of peasants and workmen. Their organization was based on equality and solidarity with the members. All members of these communes, both men and women, applied themselves willingly to their tasks in the field and in the household. Unlike many communes, people were given the personal space they desired, so any members of a commune who wanted to cook separately for themselves and their children, or to take food from the communal kitchens to eat in their own quarters, met with no objection from the other members. The management of each commune was conducted by a general meeting of all its members. In addition, the communes decided to introduce anarchist schooling based on the ideas of Francisco Ferre. See section J5.13 for details. Mahnoa himself worked on one for 2 days a week for a period. Mahnoa, quoted by Paul Avrich, Anarchist and the Russian Revolution. They were set up on the former estate of landlords and consisted of around 10 families or 100 to 300 people, and although each had peasant anarchist members, not all of the members were anarchists. Mahnoa worked on commune number 1, which was the estate of former landlord Clausen. When refounded in 1919, this commune was named after Rosa Luxemburg, the Marxist revolutionary who had recently been murdered in the German Revolution. It was a success. For the spring sowing, it had grown from 9 families to 285 members, working 340 acres of land. The communes represented a way that poor and middle peasants could pool resources to their working estates that they could not have worked otherwise, and as Michael Millay points out, they were organized from the bottom up, not the top down. However, as Mahnoa himself acknowledged, while the majority of the toiling population saw in the organization of rural communes the healthy germ of a new social life, which could provide a model of a free and communal form of life, the mass of the people did not go over to it. They cited their reasons: the advance of the Germans and Austrian armies, their own lack of organization, their inability to defend this order against the new revolutionary, Bolshevik, and counter-revolutionary authorities. For this reason, the toiling populations of the district limited their revolutionary activity to supporting in every way those bold springs. Mahnoa, quoted by Average. Given that the communes were finally destroyed by the White and Red forces in June 1919, their caution was justified. After this, peace did not return long enough for the experiment to be restarted. As Michael Millay argues, very few peasant movements in history have been able to show in practice the sort of society and type of landholding they would like to see. The Mahnoa's movement is proof that peasant revolutionaries can put forward positive, practical ideas. Mahnoa's experiments, it should be noted, have strong similarities to the rural revolution during the Spanish Revolution of 1936. See section I-8.5 and I-8.6 for more details. As well as implementing their economic ideas on workers' self-management, land reform, and free communes, the Mahnoists also organized regional congresses as well as local Soviets. Most of the activity happened in and around Hulia, the focal point of the movement. This was in accord with their vision of a free Soviet system. Needless to say, the Congress could only be called during periods of relative calm. The Mahnoist home area was not occupied by hostile forces, and so congresses of insurgents, peasants, and workers were called in early 1919 and another in October of that year. The actual dates of regional congresses were January 1919 at Velika Mikhailivka, February 1919 in Hulia, April 1919 at Hulia, October 1990 at Alexandrovsk. The Congress for the 15th of June 1919 never met because Trotsky unilaterally banned it, under pain of death to anyone even discussing it, never mind calling it or attending as a delegate. Unlike the Third Congress, which ignored a similar ban by Dybenko, the Fourth Congress could not go ahead due to the treacherous attack by the Red Army that preceded it. 4 Makhnovist commanders were executed by the Red Army for advertising this Congress. Another Congress planned for Alexandrovsk in November 1920 was also prevented by Bolshevik betrayal, namely the attack after Wrangel had been defeated. See Section 13 for further details. The reason for these regional congresses was simple: to coordinate the revolution. It was indispensable, Arshinov notes, to establish institutions which unified first a district composed of various villages, and then the district and establishment which composed the liberated region. It was indispensable to find general solutions for problems common to the entire region. It was indispensable to create organs suitable for these tasks, as the peasants did not fail to create them. These organs were the Regional Congress of Peasants and Workers. These congresses were composed of delegates of peasants, workers, and of the insurgent army, and were intended to clarify and record the decisions of the toiling masses and to be regarded as the supreme authority for the liberated area. David Footman. The first Congress, which was the smallest, discussed the strengthening of the front, the adoption of a common nomenclature for a popular organization, Soviets and the like, and to send a delegation to convince the draftees and the nationalist forces to return home. It was also decided to organize a second Congress. The second Congress was larger, having 245 delegates from 350 districts. This Congress was strongly anti-Bolshevik and favored a democratic socio-political way of life. One delegate made the issue clear. No party has a right to usurp governmental power into its own hands. We want life, all problems, to be decided locally, not by order from any authority above, and all peasants and workers should decide their own fate, while those elected should only carry out the toiler's wish. A general resolution was passed which acknowledged the fact that the Bolshevik Party was demanding a monopoly of the revolution. It also stated, with deep regret, the Congress must also declare that apart from external enemies, a perhaps even greater danger arising from its internal shortcomings threatens the revolution of the Russian and Ukrainian peasants and workers. The Soviet governments of Russia and of the Ukraine, by their orders and decrees, are making efforts to deprive local Soviets of peasants and workers' deputies of their freedom and autonomy. As noted in Section 5, the Congress also decided to issue an obligatory mobilization to gather troops for the army. It also accepted a resolution on land reform, stating that the land belongs to nobody and could be used by anyone as long as they did not use wage labor. See Section 6 for the full resolution. The Congress accepted a resolution against plunder, violence, and anti-Jewish pogroms, recognizing it as an attempt by the Tsarist government to turn the attention of all toiling people away from the real reasons for their poverty, namely the Tsarist regime's oppression. The Second Congress also elected the revolutionary military of Soviet peasants, workers and insurgents, which had no power to initiate policy but designed merely to implement the decisions of the periodic Congress. The Third Congress was the largest and most representative, with delegates to 72 volists, in which 2 million people live. This Congress aimed to clarify the situation and to consider the prospects for the future of the region. It decided to conduct a voluntary mobilization of men to fight the whites and rejected with the approval of both rich and poor peasants the Bolsheviks' expropriations. Towards the end of the Congress, it received a telegram from the Bolshevik commander Dybenko calling it counter-revolutionary, its organizers outlaws, and dissolving it by his order. The Congress immediately voted an indignant resolution in reply. This corrected Dybenko's factual mistakes on who called it, informed him why it was called, gave him a history lesson on the Makhnovist region, and asked him, can there exist laws made by a few people who call themselves revolutionaries, which permit them to outlaw a whole people who are more revolutionary than they are themselves? It is permissible, it is admissible, then they should come to the country to establish laws of violence, to subjugate a people who have just overthrown all lawmakers and all laws. Does there exist a law according to which revolutionary has the right to apply the most severe penalties to a revolutionary mass which he calls himself the defender, simply because this man has taken the good things which the revolution promised them, freedom and equality, without his permission? Should the mass of revolutionary people perhaps be silent when such a revolutionary idea takes away the freedom which they have just conquered? Do the laws of the revolution order the shooting of a delegate because he believes he ought to carry out the mandate given him by the revolutionary mass which elected him? Whose interests should the revolutionary defend? Those of the party, or those of the people who set their revolution in motion with their blood? Quoted by Arshinov. As we discussed in Section 13, Trotsky's order to ban the Fourth Congress indicates that such laws do exist, with the entire peasants and laboring populations are declared guilty of high treason if they dare participate in their own free Congress. Arshinov. The last Congress was held between 20th and 26th of October in Alexandrovsk. One delegate was to be elected per 3,000 people and one delegate per military unit. This gave 270 mostly peasant delegates. Only 18 were workers, of which 6 were Mensheviks, who walked out after Makhno called him lapdogs of the bourgeoisie during the discussion on free socioeconomic organization. The Congress passed a number of resolutions concentrating on the care of the wounded and the poorest part of the population. A voluntary mobilization, voluntary peasant contributions to feed the army, and forced levies on the bourgeoisie. According to Volin, the chairman, Makhnovist ideas were fully discussed. The idea of free Soviets, genuinely functioning in the interests of the working population, the question of direct relationships between peasants and city workers based on mutual exchange of the products of their labor, the launching of a libertarian and egalitarian social organization in the cities in the country. All these questions were seriously and closely studied by the delegates themselves with the assistance and cooperation of qualified comrades. He notes that the Congress decided that the workers, without any authority, would organize their economic, political, and administrative life for themselves, by means of their own abilities and through their own organs, united on a federal basis. It is significant to note that the Congress also discussed the activities of the Makhnovists within the city itself. One delegate raised the issue of the activities of the Kontrrazvedka, the Makhnovist counterintelligence service section. As noted in Section 5, the Makhnovists, like all the armies in the Russian Civil War, had its intelligence service. It combined a number of functions, such as military reconnaissance, arrest and holding of prisoners, and counterinsurgency. Originally, it had a positive function, but because of improper treatment of prisoners of war, it was deprived of its positive function. The delegate stated that this counter-espionage service was engaged in arbitrary acts of uncontrolled actions, of which some were very serious and rather like the Bolshevik check, quoted by Volney. Immediately, a commission of several delegates was created to investigate the situation. Volney argues that such an initiative on the part of the workers' delegates would not have been possible under the Bolshevik regime. It was by activity of this kind that the Congress gave a preview of the way in which society should function from the beginning, if it is based on a desire for progress and self-realization. Sadly, the commission could not complete its work due to the city being evacuated soon after the Congress. Another incident showed that under the Makhnovists, the civilian population was in control. A delegate noted that Klein, the Makhnovist military commander in the city, had become publicly and regularly drunk after issuing proclamations against drunkenness. Klein was called in before the Congress, which accepted his apology and his request to be sent to the front away from the boredom of desk work, which had driven him to drink. This, according to Volney, showed that the workers in their Congress were masters of the army and the army its servant. Outside of the Congress, the work of local Soviets was to be coordinated through the Revolutionary Military Soviet, RMS. The first RMS was set up in the Second Congress and consisted of one delegate for each of the 32 volsts the Makhnovists had liberated. The RMS was to be answerable to the Congress and limited to implementing their decisions, but the difficult military situation meant this seldom happened. When it did, the Third Congress, the Congress had no problem with its actions in the previous period. After the Alexandrovsk Congress, the RMS consisted of 22 delegates, including 3 known Bolsheviks and 4 non-Makhnovists. The Bolsheviks considered the remaining delegates anarchists or anarchist sympathizers. The military chaos of 1920 saw the RMS dissolved and replaced by the Soviet of Revolutionary Insurgents in the Ukraine, which consisted of several members elected by the insurgent army. Its secretary was a left socialist revolutionary. The RMS, in addition to making decisions between Congress, carried out propaganda work, including the editing of the Makhnovist paper, The Road to Freedom, and collected and distributed money. Lastly, we must discuss what happened when the Makhnovists applied their ideas to any cities they liberated, and this gives a clear idea of the way they applied their ideas in practice. Anarchist participant Joseph the Immigrant stated that it was Makhnov's custom upon taking a city or town to call the people together and announce to them that henceforth they are free to organize their lives as they think best for themselves. He always proclaims complete freedom of speech and press. He does not fill the prisons or begin executions as the communists do. He stressed it was the expression of the toilers themselves, and the first great mass movement that by its own effort seeks to free itself from government and establish economic self-determination. In that sense, it is thoroughly anarchistic. Alexander Berkman, The Bolshevik Myth. Arshinov paints a similar picture. As soon as they enter a city, they declare that they did not represent any kind of authority, that their armed forces obliged no one to work any sort of obligation, and had no other aim than to protect the freedom of the working people. The freedom of the peasants and the workers, said the Makhnovists, resides in the peasants and workers themselves, and may not be restricted. In all fields of their lives, it is up to the workers and the peasants themselves to construct whatever they consider necessary. As for the Makhnovists, they can only assist them with advice, by putting up at their disposal the intellectual or military forces they need, but under no circumstances can the Makhnovists prescribe for them in any manner. In addition, the Makhnovists fully applied the revolutionary principle of freedom of speech, of thought, of the press, and of political association. In all cities and towns occupied by the Makhnovists, they began by lifting all the prohibitions and repealing the restrictions imposed on the press and on political organization by one or another power. Indeed, the only restriction that the Makhnovists considered necessary to impose on the Bolsheviks, the left socialists, the revolutionaries, and other statists, was a prohibition on the formation of those revolutionary committees which sought to impose a dictatorship over the people. They also took the opportunity to destroy every prison they got their hands on, believing that free people have no use for prisons, which are always built only to subjugate the people, the workers, and the peasants. And the Makhnovists encouraged self-management. Looking at Alexandrovsk, they immediately invited the working population to participate in a general conference of the workers of the city. When the conference met, a detailed report was given on the military situation in the region, and it was proposed that the workers organize the life of the city and the functioning of the factories with their own forces and their own organizations, basing themselves on the principles of labor and equality. The workers enthusiastically acclaimed all these suggestions, but they hesitated to carry them out, troubled by their novelty and troubled by the nearness of the front, which made them fear that the situation of the town was uncertain and unstable. The first conference was followed by a second, and problems of organizing life according to principles of self-management by workers were examined and discussed with animation by the masses of workers, who all welcomed the idea with the greatest enthusiasm, but who only with difficulty succeeded in giving them concrete forms. Railroad workers took the first step in this direction. They formed a committee charged with organizing the railway network of this region. From this point, the proletariat of Alexandrovsk began to systematically turn the problem of creating organs of self-management. Unfortunately, the Makhnovists occupied only two sites, Alexandrovsk for 4 weeks and Katerinoslav for 2 periods and one of 5 weeks respectively. As a rule, the Makhnovists, rank and file, had little or no experience for life in the cities, and this placed severe limits on their ability to understand the specific problems of the workers there. In addition, the cities did not have a large anarchist movement, meaning that the Mensheviks and Bolsheviks had more support than they did. Both parties were, at best, neutral to the Makhnovists and anarchists, so making it likely that they would influence the city workers against the movement. As Voli noted, the absence of a vigorous organized workers' movement which could support the peasant insurgents was a disadvantage. There were minor successes in both cases. In Alexandrovsk, some trains were got running and a few factories reopened. In Katerinoslav, where the city was under a state of siege and constant bombardment by the whites, the tobacco workers won a collective agreement that had long been refused, and the bakers set themselves to preparing the socialization of their industry and drawing up plans to feed both the army and the civilian population. Unsurprisingly, the bakers had long been under anarcho-syndicalist influence. Clearly, whenever they could, the Makhnovists practiced their stated goals of working-class self-management and supported the organizational structure to ensure the control of and participation in the social revolution by the toiling masses. Equally, when they liberated towns and cities, they did not impose their own power upon the working-class population, but rather urged it to organize itself by setting up Soviets, unions, and other forms of working-class power. And they urged workers to organize self-management of industry, true to the anarchist vision of a free society. They advocated and practiced freedom of assembly, speech, and organization. In the words of historian Christopher Reed, Makhno's insurgent army was the quintessence of self-administered People's Revolutionary Army. It arose from the peasants. It was composed of peasants. It handed power to the peasants. It encouraged the growth of communes, cooperatives, and Soviets, but distrusted all permanent elites hunting to take hold within them. It would be foolish to assume that Makhno was supported by every peasant, or that he and his followers could not, on occasion, direct their cruelty towards dissidents within their own ranks. But on the whole, the movement perhaps erred to the side of being too self-effacing, of handing too much authority to the population at key moments, from Tsar to Soviets. As such, Makhnovists preferred to match his theory. This can be said of few social movements, and it is to their credit that this is the